Hello and welcome to Then It Was a Game. My name's Kevin Flanagan with Boston Sports Desk, joined alongside, as always, by John Horrigan, five-time Emmy Award winner, folklorist, and longtime public address announcer for the Boston Bruins alumni, joining us to talk about a very interesting and timely subject, the history of the Boston Marathon, is Mr. Dick Johnson, who has been the curator of the Sports Museum since its inception in 1982. He's authored or co-authored more than 20 books on Boston sports and is considered the preeminent resource for sports, not only in New England, but across the country. Welcome, gentlemen, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And today we're going to be talking about the Boston Marathon. But we're deep diving ancient sports, old sports, any sport, because everybody's going retro these days. And that's what the purpose of the show is. In this episode, the Boston Marathon, I guess, Dick, we base it upon the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC. Darius I, trying to subjugate Athens, meets on the plain of Marathon. He meets Miltiades, the Athenian general, and essentially Miltiades lures in the center of the Persian line, surrounds the passes, so the mighty Persian cavalry can't get in. They are outnumbered, but they just whoop the Persians. Phidippides, long-distance messenger, runs approximately 26 miles back to Athens, and as he gets there, he drops dead and says, "Joy to you, we've won," and drops dead. And it comes back afterwards in 1896, Dick, with the first Olympic marathon when the Olympics were brought back in 1896.
It does, and Spiridon Lewis, a native of Greece, of course, appropriately wins the inaugural Olympic marathon, and by doing so inspires a gentleman named John Graham, who was the coach of the Boston contingent. Almost all these athletes coming from America to Athens for that first modern Olympics were either from Princeton, New Jersey, or Boston. And the Boston contingent was coached by a gentleman named John Graham, who would later become track coach at Harvard. And John was inspired by what he had seen in Athens and brought the idea of the marathon back to the BAA, the Boston Athletic Association, and they decided to hold a race that, when it started, went from Ashland to Boston. And the Boston Marathon, as we know it, was born in 1897. And the early history of the race is interesting because it was a big event publicly because it coincided with Patriots' Day. So it was a state celebration anyway. It was a bit of a curiosity because people didn't run marathons back then. I mean, this wasn't something that your neighbor would be entered into. You weren't raising money for anything. I mean, this was maybe 50, starting with maybe about 50, 60 men only, of course, who had been track athletes, who, had run for track clubs and athletic clubs. It was not as formal. It was, not as structured and widespread an activity as it is now. And but like anything else, a great tradition has to get started, and it started here, and it kept going every year. And when the race began, or when the event began, a fair portion of the course was run on dirt roads. I mean, the automobile hadn't become a part of our lives just yet. So probably the most prevalent injury early on were stone bruises. And when you consider the equipment these runners had, it really makes you sort of stand back and in awe, I think, because can you imagine running in the equivalent of a pair of dress shoes? Which is basically what the early equipment was. It was, maybe dress shoes and a heavy pair of socks. Running 26 miles in that getup, I mean, I find it remarkable. I mean, as late as really the 1930s, you had guys running and winning Boston in the equivalent of a pair of Jack Purcell sneakers, if you remember those canvas tennis shoes, which, are sort of more of a style statement now than they are used for anything athletically. I mean, so the equipment, the challenges that these athletes faced early on, to me, is one of the main factors. I mean, could you convince an elite runner now to even run a mile, much less 26 miles, even run a mile in a pair of street shoes? I mean, in a pair of dress shoes, they'd look at you as though you'd lost your mind.
And Dick, imagine the people that run bare feet in the marathon.
Well, I'll tell you, it's really interesting. I know a little about this sport because I did compete at Boston one year, and I was a runner in both high school and college in cross country and track. But
Tell that story.
Yeah, there was a runner from Connecticut named Dr. Charlie Robbins, and Charlie Robbins was a really good distance runner back in the tail end of the 30s, going up into the 50s. But of course, he continued to run for years. But one of the things that set Charlie apart was he ran most of his road races barefoot. The Boston, Abebe Bikila, athletes of that stature. And, now I'm trying to recall whether he'd ever run a marathon barefoot. I don't think so, but he ran 10Ks barefoot on pavement streets. I mean, this wasn't cross country. This was, so, I dare say it would be very hard to find an elite athlete now who would run barefoot. I think the last athlete of that stature I could think of that did run barefoot, but on track, was a woman named Zola Budd, who was the notorious participant in the fall of Mary Decker Slaney in the '84 Olympics. But again, this is a topic that's not discussed really hardly at all. So I felt this is probably a good forum to do so. Never hear anybody talk about the fact that these runners ran really good times in equipment that not only was challenging, but to me would be impossible to contend with now. I mean, you couldn't imagine doing it.
You've written a book about it, about Boston Marathon, but you also have firsthand experience. You've run it. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, I went to a private school up in Groton called Lawrence Academy, and I ran cross country there. I enjoyed it. I did pretty well. In my senior year, did an independent project of, I said, well, spending another year in JV basketball, I love basketball, but I'd like to try running the marathon. And they allowed me to do it. So they said, oh, okay, fine. So I did my training. I certainly was in good enough shape to do this. And I ran my qualifier. Of course, I didn't know anything about running a marathon. So I ran my qualifier on St. Patrick's Day, less than a month before Boston. And it's not optimal to do that. So I ran the Earth Day Marathon on Long Island on a day that the race director said it was the worst weather for a marathon he had encountered in 50 years. So, okay, all right, that sort of sets that up. So I ran my 3:08, which I think on a good day would have been about a 2:50. And I felt pretty good going into Boston less than a month later, and then ran a 2:57:05 on a perfect day to run a marathon. It was sort of overcast in the low 60s. It was the year that the only Irishman ever to win Boston won, a gentleman named Neil Cusack, and so it was a genuine thrill. I mean, here I was. Student at a high school that had my graduating class was probably 70 people, and we didn't have a track team that spring, so this was the only chance I'd really have to run competitively. And
were you old enough? Old enough to?
Well, it's funny. This is the one thing I share with former Governor Michael Dukakis. I had seen that he had run Boston when he was a senior at Brookline High School. And the one time I sat and met with him, it was about sports museum stuff, but I said, hey, I got to ask you a personal question. And he sort of gave me a look. I said, no, it's about sports. I said, when you ran Boston, did you have to lie about your age too? Because I ran Boston when I was in high school. And he said, well, he said, I'll be honest. Yes, I had to add a year to my age on the application. I said, here, shake my hand. I said, we're two of probably many people, probably not a huge number, but probably a significant number who just had to run Boston, and they'd qualified. I certainly had qualified. The governor finished, I think he was in like the top 100. He did very well, and then he ran cross country at Swarthmore College. So, I'm proud to sort of be in the same category as our former governor of, yes, having told a white lie, not a big one, but in order to get to the starting line with a number. I mean, I could have been a bandit. I could have jumped in from the hedges or something, but I really didn't want to do that. I had worked hard and trained and had qualified, and I wasn't going to let a year get in my way. And so, that's my story. And I can remember how once you got to about maybe the 19-mile mark, you could see both the John Hancock and the Prudential Towers looming ahead. I mean, talk about a carrot on a stick. You could see the outline, the skyline of Boston, with those two buildings sort of being the most prominent, sort of like the goalposts at the end of a football field. And it was like, this really hurts. I'm getting there. I'm not going to be done. There's just no way. I'm not going to, I'm not going to walk. I'm going to run the whole way. I mean, at a certain point, I thought, why didn't I run my qualifier earlier? But you live and you learn, right? But it was the athletic experience of a lifetime. And what I compare it to, and I've used this analogy before talking to people about the race, to me, it's a bit like the Masters, because it's run at the same time each year on the same course, except unlike the Masters, every man and woman can compete on the same day as the great champions of the world. Now, there's staggered starts now because, again, the field when I ran was probably about 2,600 runners, which seemed a lot to me at the time. Now it's 15 times that. I mean, it's, 37,000 people. But so to me, it was like, if I were a golfer, it'd be like getting to play the Masters on the same day as the champions. So I think that's one of the hallmarks of Boston, is it's like a version of the Masters golf tournament, but for the people. And like the Masters, you have to qualify too. I mean, it's not, yes, there's the charity division, and God bless the charity division. The charity division has raised hundreds of millions of dollars for any number of very worthy entities. But, the heart and soul of the race are still the working class heroes and the regular men and women that get out there and put their sweatsuits on and slog through the snow and the rain and the mud to get to the starting line. I mean, it's one of the great events. I mean, there are 37,000 individual stories now each year about Boston, and that just keeps growing and growing. I mean, if they could increase the starting field to 100,000, they could do so easily. I mean, the only thing that really constrains Boston is that there's a limit to the capacity of the field and how many folks you can accommodate. And again, that makes it even more special, because to say that you've even gotten to the starting line at Boston is almost as much an accomplishment as saying you got to the finish line.
Right. And talk about that course. Everybody in the world knows the term Heartbreak Hill. Something that I've just come to know recently was the Scream Tunnel near Wellesley College. But just talk about, it's 26 miles, 385 yards. Allegedly, the distance that Phidippides ran. Some say it retraces the steps of the British retreat back to Boston. That's a stretch. But just talk about the course itself. It goes through 8 cities and towns. Hopkinton starts and ends in Boston.
Yeah, well, of course, the ancient course was approximately, but the actual, the 385-yard thing, it was actually based on the distance of the marathon course in the London Olympics in 1908. and it was the distance from Windsor Castle to the finish of the race in London. So that's, with poor Durando Pietri. So that's why they have the extra 385 yards. But anyway, getting back to the course. So it's one of those events where, again, now I think one of the big challenges is there's so many people in the starting field. It doesn't start to thin out. You really can't, as a regular runner, not one of the elite field, of course, but as a regular runner, you really can't start to get your stride until 5 or 6 miles into the race. Now, when I ran it in 74, it was a lot easier to do that. And the one caution I was given was don't go out too fast, because it's downhill for the first 6 miles. So your tendency is, with your adrenaline, you're there are crowds along the route starting right from the get-go. It's not the tunnel of noise at Wellesley, but it's a tunnel, and there are people and they're cheering, and depending on what they see, if they see a name of a school on your shirt or something, they'll start to root for you, or they'll root for your number. I think I was E81, so it was, oh, come on, E81, like, hey, that's me. So you try not to go out too fast. You realize that the demarcation points that you really want to look for are, at least the first one that I made sure that I actually saw, was the clock tower in Wellesley. So right after you run through the tunnel of Wellesley College co-eds, which is great. You can hear them and see them, and they're screaming, and it's pretty cool. This is at about 13 miles. A little after that is the Wellesley Town Clock Tower. So right on the route, right adjacent to it, is a clock tower, stone clock tower. And, I don't think I was even wearing a watch that day. And certainly this was before there were, the timer is a Casio timer or something. So, I was completely old school. I just looked up at the clock tower because I wanted to beat 3 hours. So when I saw that I was, I basically was on schedule to do that. It was like that gave me a little boost. And then after that, you basically know that you're heading towards the hills in Newton, and you prepare for them. I had not gone to the course beforehand and had run parts of it. So this was all, I'm running blind here in terms of knowing the topography of the marathon route. I knew about it from a written standpoint. I knew at what mile mark to start to gauge the hills and when they get higher and then when they start going down. But it's one of those things where, you find a runner or two to pace yourself off at different points in the race. You're very aware of when you might need water. You certainly don't want to cramp up. If you drank too soon, that might precipitate a cramp, and that'll just destroy you psychologically, because you slow down or you have to stop. That didn't happen to me. I don't think I drank once during the race. I think I basically was so keyed up and so fed by adrenaline that it was like, no, just keep going, but be mindful of your pace, and then be mindful of your sort of how you're doing, how you're feeling. And I got through Heartbreak Hill fine. I certainly had run many hills in Groton and Northwest Worcester County. It was, certainly there are plenty of hills there. So I was no stranger to that. And then, heading down from Boston College to the finish line, to me, that's the most difficult part of the race, because you've reached a point physiologically where you've used up most of your glycogen base. This is where some of the expert runners will start to drink a little Powerade or Gatorade or whatever they had at the time. Again, I didn't feel the need to do that, and I didn't feel any cramping or any muscle discomfort. It was more fatigue, and I think the fatigue was, this is the second time I'd run a marathon, the second time I'd run a marathon within a month. So, it was unexplored territory. And then it was just, keying off the runners that you were running near or that you were running a little behind. So, it's a good way to run, actually, is, you're certainly not in a race for first place or anything, but you're in a race for time, and you're running against yourself primarily. But it's great to have other people to that are part of they're your unspoken partners. And for me, it was a runner named Charlie Ratty, and Charlie was a fellow member. I was a member of the North Medford Track Club at the time, and Charlie, who I didn't know well, but I knew him from the club, and I knew that he had run times very similar to the ones I was hoping to do. So I sort of keyed on him, and the one picture, the one still photograph I have from the race, that a guy named Rick Levy, who was a famous photographer for the marathon, he basically would take a picture of everybody, and you'd get a note in the mail about a month after the race saying, "I took your picture, and if you'd like to order one, send me $10. And yeah, I couldn't send it fast enough. But it's a great picture of me and Charlie we're running towards Kenmore Square, and it's easy to tell the location we're at because there used to be a place called Sergeant Pepper's Pizza, not far from the ballpark. So he and I basically are grimacing with our heads down as we're, plunging towards the last probably mile and a half of the race. And the funny thing about it was years later, okay, this is like maybe 30 years after, maybe 25 years after this, I realized that, oh, hey, wait a minute. My good friend who's on the board of directors of the BAA, one of the people that runs and manages the marathon, is Gloria Ratty. And I said, Gloria, you've got to be related to Charlie. She said, of course. He said, Charlie's my husband. I said, all right. I said, but I had never met you back in the 1970s, so I wasn't aware of that. And of course, I found out that he'd passed on, which made me very sad. But Gloria, who's my great friend, and she's one of the great people in Boston sports, just incredible. And she's been on the board of the BAA for decades. She just turned 90. And you talk to anybody involved with the Boston Marathon, and Gloria Ratty is in the same category as legendary figures as Will Cloney and Jock Semple, and Guy Morse in terms of these, and Tom Grilk now, who's the head of the BAA, Dave McGilvery, who's also my great friend and former track club teammate. These are the people that make the marathon. It's not necessarily just the elite athletes and the great champions, but it's the people that have been the heart and soul of the BAA for generations, and who really tie it back to the days when, the only thing you got as a runner was a bowl of beef stew at the end of the race and a pat on the back. And of course, if you were lucky enough to be one of the elites, you got a medal or a trophy, depending on how you finished. But again, it's sort of a road that just keeps going and going. Again, when I saw that the only picture I had, sort of evidence other than my certificate, was a picture of myself and Charlie, Gloria's husband, Gloria, who is acknowledged as sort of the heart and soul of the race, it just makes me feel great. I mean, it's sort of, there's a race that you ran that day, but then there's a race that goes on for decades afterwards,
Right. And the as you mentioned, the BAA, without the BAA, and we have the logo, the insignia up top, there's no marathon. I believe they formed 10 years before the first marathon.
Yeah.
But that first Boston Marathon was won by J.J. McDermott. And then the next one, I believe, was won by Ronald McDonald. I don't know if he was in full clown gear or not. But talk about those first few years. You're talking about dirt roads, no footwear, dress shoes, probably no water stops, right? I mean,
no, and this was really the history of the race, really up until the early 70s was, it was a place where to use the lyric of Lennon, it was where a working class hero was something to be. It was where, all of the great champions were school teachers, were policemen. I mean, it was, of course, it was mostly a male domain, of course. And of course, that changed much to the betterment of the race. But this was not the domain of professional athletes. There were no shoe contracts. There were, it was And of course, it was a story of a hardy group of Americans who, at least are from the 50s on, were competing against foreign athletes who, to a certain extent, were sort of quasi-professional athletes, But anyway, turning the clock back to the early years, the great hero of the marathon for its first 30 years was a gentleman named Clarence DeMar, who was a distance runner who had dropped out of the University of Vermont, had moved to Boston, had won the race. I forget the first year that he won, but after he had won Boston at least once, he was told by his cardiologist that he risked death by running the Boston Marathon. So there's a hiatus of like 10 years where he didn't run Boston. He won the race 7 times. He'd have won Boston. He could have conceivably won the race 10 times additional to that 7 times. But he finally, just decided to throw the dice, I guess, and won the marathon 7 times. He then continued his education and got degrees from both Harvard and BU. And a great thing, and again, a movie script could be written about DeMar. He'd win Boston. He would then go to work as a typesetter for the Boston Herald. And he'd set the type, declaring he had won the marathon. So he'd set the type for both the front page, because of course it would be a big front page banner headline, and for the sports page, talking about his victory. There's something completely charming about that, and you couldn't make it up. I mean, it would be impossible to make that up.
Sure. And one thing, Dick, DeMar, as you said, 7 marathons, which is inconceivable. Probably would have won more. Certainly one of the greatest athletes in the history of Boston that people don't know about. But one thing that I looked up, I saw in 1918, and that year is significant. There was a Spanish flu outbreak in Fort Devens, but that didn't hit until September, October.
Yep.
And the Fort Devens relay team, just before the Spanish flu, won the Boston Marathon. What's up with that?
Well, I think it was out of respect to the war effort, too, that certainly any able-bodied male was expected to be in uniform and not, competing in an event like a marathon. So that was really the prevailing sentiment at the time. It was interesting that Major League Baseball was really on the chopping block that year. The plans were for Major League Baseball to suspend operations for a year, and the much maligned Harry Frazee was the owner that went to speak to the powers that be in Washington. He spoke to Secretary of War Newton Baker, who was a buddy of his, and said, "Look, you've got to stop this. We've got to have baseball. It'll be good for morale." I mean, the same argument was used during World War II to continue Major League Baseball. So if it weren't for Harry Frazee, everybody's favorite bad guy, we might not have had a 1918 World Championship team, because he not only made it possible for that team to play, but for all the teams to play. So the marathon sentiment was certainly connected to the war. But it was interesting, the year before, 1917, the winner, Bricklayer Bill Kennedy, is one of my favorite marathon champions, because Bricklayer Bill came to Boston, and the night before his victory, he slept on a pool table, because he was another working class hero. He couldn't afford to, a hotel room, and he certainly wasn't offered one. He slept on a pool table. I mean, that's another scene from a movie. It's like, get out of here. I mean, it's hard enough to run Boston. And then the other story that I'll tell, which is a little out of time sequence, but is very similar. So in 1966, Roberta Gibb, a native of Winchester, who had since moved to San Diego to be with her husband, who was in the military, Bobby Gibb, as we know her now. Okay, Bobby thought she'd run Boston, but she wasn't going to try to get a number. I mean, this wasn't a political statement by her. She just wanted to run Boston because she's a runner, but not in the formal sense of having been on a college track team or anything. This to me is just, I just put my hand on my forehead and go, how do you do this? She took a Trailways bus from San Diego to Boston.
My God.
I mean, just that alone is a marathon. Can you imagine how miserable that would be? We've all tried to sleep on a bus, right? Okay. So
Awful.
days long journey. I don't know how many days, 4 days, 5 days, probably 5 days. Because I've driven cross country twice. And, I mean, if you're on a bus, it's going all the time. But if you're going 800 miles a day, because they do have to stop and fuel up and get food and everything. I mean, anyway, horrible. She gets home to Winchester the day before the race. She, of course, with no idea of what the diet should be to run, she eats a steak dinner the night before running Boston. I mean, talk about basically handicapping yourself. I mean, the only thing that she didn't do was run the thing in golf shoes. I mean, how the heck do you? And she runs Boston, and she runs a great time. I forget what her time was, but it was superb. It was world class. I mean, if they had a women's marathon back then, which they did not, they wouldn't have it for another 8 years as an official entry. I mean, it's remarkable. And the headline in the Boston, in the Record American was Boston Bride, runs. It was just this very charming thing. And she was wearing a sort of a homemade outfit. Almost looked like she was wearing clam diggers. And she ran Boston beautifully. And I've talked to her about it. And she said the male runners who she was amidst during the race were all cheering her on. They just couldn't believe it. They had never seen this before. And they were, her cheering section the whole time. I mean, and the reason that her run in 1966 didn't become the contentious history-making incident that occurred with Catherine Switzer the following year was because she wasn't wearing a number. And Jacques Semple and the race authorities who were monitoring the runners on the course, all right, she's running the race, but she's not doing so in a way that interferes with the organization or the rules of the race. And Catherine Switzer, who ran the race the year after, wearing a number because she entered as Pace Switzer, and she didn't write Catherine down. That becomes sort of the cause celeb. But Bobby Gibb, again, she gets a medal for that Trailways journey across the country from San Diego. I mean, a transcontinental bus ride, and then running a Boston a day later. I mean, I challenge any champion athlete to do that now. I bet they might have trouble finishing the race.
Yep. And you mentioned Catherine Switzer, one of the most iconic photographs, and finally she's getting recognition. She wasn't the first. She was accosted. And you spoke about Jacques Semple. There were other great race directors, Walter Brown, Will Cloney. But talk about that photo and that confrontation.
Well, again, I talked to Jacques about it. I unfortunately, I don't know Catherine, but I talked to Jacques about it. And of course, when I spoke with him, it was in the 1980s. He had already become fast friends with Catherine Switzer. Because, as he said, I made us both famous, and it's well, okay, yeah, that's sort of true. And Jacques was made out to be a villain at the time, and Jacques' argument was, no, I wasn't trying to tear the number off her because she is a woman, because the rules of the race. I mean, the rule book was that the race was only open to men officially, and he was not, he wasn't being a bad guy. I mean. He was a garrulous character. He was beloved by everybody. I mean, I've never talked to any person that encountered or dealt with Jacques Semple that didn't not just like him, but love him. He was a great runner himself. I think his highest finish at Boston was either 5th or 7th. So he's a really good runner. He worked as a physical therapist at the Garden, where he treated everybody from Jack Dempsey to Bobby Orr to Bill Russell to, I mean, there wasn't an athlete in Boston that hadn't made a visit to Jacques Semple's, his office at the old offices adjacent to the Boston Garden. And so he was someone who did the race directorship as a volunteer. He wasn't getting paid a dime. when Will Cloney was doing it, and I knew Will quite well. In fact, I received an award in his name, which just was a great honor to me. They'd handle the applications and process the checks and everything as volunteers. I mean, they're the lifeblood of this. And this was at a time that not only did the BAA have the marathon, they had an elite indoor track meet at the Garden that was held each year too. So, you know, the role of the BAA in Boston sports history is significant above and beyond simply the marathon. Of course, its greatest contribution now to the world is the marathon, but that part of the marathon that is a platform for charitable contributions to a raft of charities. I mean, that is, it's so great that part of what really characterizes the heart and soul of Boston are the fact that the Jimmy Fund is a single entity with the help of the Red Sox, of course, and the identification, of course, first with the Boston Braves who started it, but then the Red Sox is, I'm sure, the world's most prominent sports-related charity for cancer research and treatment. And then you have the BAA with the marathon, where I forget the list of charities that are supported by it. Of course, it also includes the Sports Museum, hundreds of charities. And I'm guessing at some point, someone will do the math on this. I'm sure that collectively runners have raised over $1 billion for charities over the years that they've had the charitable, where they've had the bibs issued to charities. I mean, so, we could talk about the marathon for, hours. I could have a cup of tea here on steady stream, and with a bathroom break or two, we could talk for 24 hours. But it's an event that sort of combines all of the best of Boston, the way the Red Sox do with the Jimmy Fund. That
Yep.
You want to talk about the heart and soul. You want to talk about the muscle of Boston strong. Okay, look at our World Series trophies, but more importantly, look at what we do for charity. Look at the number of patients that have been treated at the Dana-Farber. I mean, this is saving lives. Yep. The charity that's undertaken through the vehicle of the marathon saves lives. You can't get any better than that.
You can't.
Richard, let's harken back to the beginning of the marathon and the beginning of the traditions.
Sure.
When did all these nicknames start coming in? I know they didn't. The marathon was a shorter route in its beginning, but when did you start to hear about Heartbreak Hill? When did you hear, a lot of these different things that are second nature to those of us who watch the marathon now, but started out at the beginning of that?
Well, Heartbreak Hill, I remember talking to former Globe Sports editor Jerry Nason, and Jerry was a good friend of mine. I was so privileged to get to know him after I'd begun work at the Sports Museum in 1982. And I'd been a great admirer of Jerry because he wrote a pamphlet on the history of the Boston Marathon that was published by the Globe. And I had obtained a copy of that. In fact, a friend of mine gave me a copy when they knew I was planning to run Boston. And I just devoured that. I read every word, and I was always hoping someday I'd get to meet Jerry. Well, I did. I went to his house in Winchester, and we sat in his side porch. And one of the first things I asked him was, "It's my understanding you named Heartbreak Hill." He said, "Well, yes, I did." I said, "Okay, all right, tell me. Well, what's the deal with that?" Well, he said, in the 1936 race, hometown hero Johnny Kelly, who had won the race the previous year, had was chasing a runner named Ellison Tarzan Brown from Rhode Island in the Newton Hills. They were having a duel. He said it was like watching a boxing match. It was just these two guys who had parted from the field and were just going hammer and tongs at each other. And he said, at one point in the race, just as they're nearing the peak of the Newton Hills, Johnny was catching up to Brown, was right at his shoulder, and made what Johnny thought was the sportsmanlike gesture of tapping him on the shoulder. In a way, it's just to say, I'm here, and we're both competing. We're having the run of our lives. I think he tried to say something like, "Hey, attaboy," or something. He wasn't doing it to, as a psychological thing for his advantage. He just sort of gave him a tap on the shoulder. Well, Jerry described it. It was like someone had given Brown, had fired a gun, a starter's pistol or something. Brown, I think, didn't expect Johnny to be that near him at that point, and just bolted. I mean, it was. I mean, if this were captured on film, it would probably looks like a Tex Avery cartoon, where whoa, the Roadrunner is just going to start, zooming. Yeah, has just been approached by the coyote, and Brown throws in a surge at that point, and adrenaline surge. He changes his pace. Probably is running 20 seconds faster per mile, and it just kills Johnny. I mean, it's just like, and I remember years after speaking to Johnny about it, because I got to know him pretty well, and he would never talk about the races he won. He is a typical competitor, even into his 80s and 90s. He would still just talk about the races he'd lost and the mistakes he'd made and how mad he was at himself still. And I remember looking at him one time saying, "John, that was 70 years ago. I mean, you're considered the greatest runner in marathon history." I said, you shouldn't be so hard on yourself. But Jerry Nason captured it perfectly, that Johnny Kelly was defending his marathon title. If he had not touched Ellison Tarzan Brown on the shoulder, would he have continued, and would there not have been the adrenaline surge in Brown? Oh, we won't really know. They both might have ran the fastest times of their lives, and it would have been a sprint to the finish. But the fact is that Johnny lost his marathon crown on Heartbreak Hill, just making a simple sportsmanlike gesture that was misinterpreted wordlessly into throwing the gauntlet down. And the rest is history, as they say.
And Johnny Kelly went on to run 61 Boston marathons and 2 Olympics.
Okay. The context I put that into is I remember when Cal Ripken Jr. was approaching the record number of consecutive games, and incredible feat. But I remember thinking when that was carrying, what was that, a 95? Okay, Johnny ran his first Boston Marathon in 1928. Okay, Lou Gehrig had only played, I don't think Gehrig had even played 200 Major League games at that point. So Johnny started his Boston marathons. He only missed one due to an operation. He had appendicitis and needed to have that operated on. I think he gets a mulligan for that. I think you can give him a pass on that one, okay? But he begins his Boston Marathon string when Gehrig no one's even talking about a consecutive game string for him. That wasn't even on the horizon. And Johnny finishes his string of Boston Marathons when the Cal Ripken, when the possibility of his breaking Gehrig's string is right on the front burner. Who's the Iron Man? I think Johnny's the Iron Man. Okay, he isn't getting paid a dime. He's working at any number of different jobs. In fact, at least in one year that he had competed, I think it was his first year, he was unemployed. So it helped him get a job as a florist. But for most of his career, he worked for the Boston Edison Company. In fact, he worked in a facility that was laden with asbestos. So someone, probably as a graduate school project sometime, could look up the employees that worked with Johnny at Boston Edison in the same facility that he did, that was infested with asbestos, a complete environmental hazard. how many of those workers died young? And then you had Johnny, who not only did he work a full 8-hour day, he'd run to work, get home, take a nap, run again at night. And again, this is in equipment that's like running in street shoes. And then make himself a meal at night, probably have a cup of coffee, and then collapse, and then do it day after day after day. I mean, I find the accomplishments of these runners from the early years of the marathon to be really beyond belief sometimes, because you had to be so physically strong, and then you had to contend with the challenges of equipment that would be inconceivable today. I mean, certainly a modern day golfer could golf with hickory shaft golf clubs. That wouldn't be a big deal, because that wouldn't involve physical pain. You know, Bryson DeChambeau wouldn't be able to drive at 500 yards. You know, he may be able to drive at 280 yards, but it wouldn't be the same. But the runners, the marathoners, you're talking about pain. That really. So again, you know, I keep emphasizing that, but it's not a topic that's discussed much, and I think it should be more.
Absolutely. And it's ironic that you talked about when he began in the Depression running the Boston Marathon.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as a jet engine. When he retired, we had space stations orbiting the Earth. So that's kind of cool. Can I ask you about post-World War II?
Yeah.
There's, I think it's 47 is when Soo-Yeon Bok wins it, but then the Korean War comes about in the 1950s and they start discriminating. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's interesting that post-war, the race that's the most significant race post-war, and it may be the most significant race at Boston apart from 2013 in terms of really the overall impact that it had, was the 1946 race, where Stylianos Kyriakidis comes to Boston from Greece. He had run Boston before. He had actually come here in 1938 as one of the favorites to win Boston, didn't win, and then endured terrible hardship during World War II. You know, Greece isn't thought of as one of the battlefields of World War II, but it was. And he was a fee collector for the electric light company in Athens. So he was a well-known figure in Greece. He'd competed in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, so he was a Greek hero. He was, you know, someone that certainly was on part of the landscape of sports in Greece. And his war experience was completely harrowing. Again, another movie script. At one point, German troops are looking for informants who were relaying radio messages to the citizens of Athens. Now, it was illegal and punishable by death if you had a radio and were listening to news reports of the war. The Germans wanted to control all the information that was being fed through propaganda sources. And what Kyriakidis did is he had a radio hidden away in his home. He would get the news. He would then, as he was going around to collect money for the electric bills from people, tell people what was going on. So he was sort of a town crier. He was apprehended and was gathered with a group of men who were about to be shot, about to be executed. And what saved his life was the fact that he kept on his person, in his wallet, his Olympic ID from the Berlin Olympics in 1936 that happened to include a swastika on it. And when the authorities were looking through his papers, you can imagine this being a black and white film with, Humphrey Bogart playing Kyriakidis. They're looking through his wallet, and the Major Strasser character from Casablanca, you can imagine him coming up in his, saying, "You see this ID you have? Did you meet the Führer? Did you meet Hitler?" And Kyriakidis says, "Yeah, I did. I did meet the, I did meet Hitler." And so it was decided that, well, we really can't execute this man, because if word gets back to Hitler that we've executed one of the Olympians that was part of what he considered to be his Olympics, it might not go over that well. And so his Olympic status spared his life. He committed himself to doing something from then on athletically, that he would revive his athletic career, and whether it be at the next Olympic Games or whether it be at Boston, because he was a marathoner, and he committed himself to getting in shape and returning to a platform of glory. Well, his choice was Boston in 1946. Of course, the Olympics weren't held again until 48. So Boston was his first opportunity to make a statement. He gets to the starting line, and they try to prevent him from running the race because he was so haggard, he was so thin. They didn't think he would live, that there was a chance they'd have a fatality. And it was only through the intercession of a Greek-American state representative who basically said, look, I'll sign the papers. I'll take responsibility for anything that happens to Kyriakides. So Kyriakides runs Boston. He is carrying in his hand a handwritten statement, which was the same statement that allegedly were the words that Phidippides had brought to Athens from the Battle of Marathon. He holds this in his hand throughout the entire race. And of course, his rival, who was his rival in 1938, or one of his rivals in 1938, is Johnny Kelly. And so he and Kelly duel, and Kyriakides, against all odds, I mean, again, it's a Hollywood story. He wins Boston, Stylianos Kyriakides, a year after World War II ends. And of course, this was right as the civil war was starting in Greece. So things in his home country were still very perilous and fraught with contention. He wins Boston. And of course, one of his friends asked to see what he was holding in his hand. And it simply said, we are victorious.
That's awesome.
What a great story.
That's one of those stories where, and then what happens following the race is remarkable. It's as remarkable as his victory on the race course. He basically turns his victory into a victory tour that's a fundraising effort for the citizens of Greece. So he speaks to every HEPA council on the East Coast. He's being, given train tickets to speak to this group and that group. He raises, now this is in 1946, he raises $400,000, which in today's money would probably be over $5 million. People are giving the nation of Greece livestock. They're saying, oh, here, we want to buy cows and we want to send sheep to Greece. And so he returns to Athens over a month later, and he's greeted by the largest civic celebration for a citizen of Greece in memory. Over 1 million people come out and cheer him in a motorcade going through the streets of Athens. It's a remarkable story. Again, it's sort of beyond being a Hollywood story. And it changed the profile of Boston Marathon internationally utterly. The Boston now became an international event. I mean, we'd had runners from other countries in the past, but it was almost an intramural competition between the United States and Canada each year. Because, you had Gerard Cote up against Johnny Kelly. I mean, you had, I'm trying to think of his first name, but a runner named Young from Canada who had won it one year. I mean, you basically, you had, Walter Young. Yeah, well, Walter Young, who was a policeman in Verdun, Quebec. I mean, you had runners from Canada and the U.S., but not many foreign runners. Well, anyway, the 46 race opened the floodgates, and runners not only were coming from Europe, but were coming from Asia, which was very
Scandinavia.
Yeah, well, Scandinavia, especially we had a large Finnish contingent every year. And they would be housed in Fitchburg because of the large Finnish American population there. So it was almost like a home event for them because there's so many Finnish Americans in that Fitchburg community they would stay at their homes. They would come to Boston a month early, and they would know the course, and they'd run it and train it, And a number of those great finish runners were government employees, where there was a wink and a nod in terms of their having to be at work every day. They were there representing their country, because not only was Boston important, the Olympics were important, because the 52 Olympics certainly were being, staged in Helsinki. So, it was a big deal. This is the country of Paavo Nurmi. Anyway, Boston becomes an international event of note and great stature starting in 46.
Sure. And banning Koreans, we were involved in the Korean War. That's still going on, by the way. But guys like from Scandinavia, I know Oxenen, Relay Vandendriech were some of the multiple marathon winners. Yeah. So we get through the 50s and the 60s, and I've heard this guy speak before. He won it once in 1968. Can you talk about Amby Burfoot?
Well, I'm going to talk about Amby, but I'm also going to talk about John J. Kelly, who was his mentor. So I'll first talk about John J., because in my estimation, John J. Kelly of Groton, Connecticut, is the most important, most significant American marathoner of all time. Notice I didn't say best, although he's really good. He held the fort for elite American marathoners from the period of the early 50s on to Amby Burfoot's win in 1968. John Jay won the race in 57. He had been a track star at Boston University. He was a runner who was a quintessential amateur, because he was training while going to both college and graduate school. So he was another one of these guys who would be training early in the morning, late at night. I know when he was at BU, he had two jobs, actually. He had to pay his tuition. He worked at a jewelry store, and then he worked at I think it was the restaurant that preceded the Pewter Pot over in Harvard Square. So he'd run back and forth to work so he did a lot of running on the Esplanade. And then when he finally became a school teacher, which was his profession, he taught down in Connecticut, near where he was from, at Fitch High School. Patriots Day's not a holiday in Connecticut, so he'd have to take a day. He'd have to use one of his days off. It wasn't hard enough to be running against the policeman from Helsinki, who basically was on almost on a paid track team. He had to do so. He had to take a day off from school. And of course, he held the fort for American marathoning for really a good almost 20 years. So it was a time period where he almost literally and figuratively handed the baton off to his protege, because he coached him in high school, Amby Burfoot, because he was both a teacher and a coach in high school. And Amby was his prize pupil. And Andy, who was a student at Wesleyan University, was on a cross-country team with a runner named Bill Rogers and another runner named Jeff Galloway. I mean, talk about a great team for a little Division III school. Runners who all became significant figures in American running history. But Amby won Boston in an Olympic year, which was often a good year for an American to run if they wanted to win, because a lot of American runners were aiming for the Olympic trials. But Amby knew this would be a great year for him to take a shot at Boston. And God, what a runner he was. I actually competed against him because he ran for years and years, and he would always win the Manchester Road Race in Connecticut, the Thanksgiving Day event, which is almost sort of Connecticut's miniature version of Boston. But Amby Burfoot became as much of an ambassador and really he set a level for American distance running that was then surpassed competitively by Bill Rogers, his cross-country teammate. And then you had Frank Shorter at nearby Yale, who was basically running at Yale at the same time Amby was competing at Wesleyan. And you have this incubator of distance running talent in New England that almost made us sort of a English speaking, or a North American equivalent of Kenya or Ethiopia. It was remarkable.
And Frank Shorter, you mentioned after he won the gold in the Olympics in Munich 72, that tragic Olympics, that's when long distance running really takes off nationally in the United States.
Yeah, you had the two figures of Steve Prefontaine and Frank Shorter, who really fed the enthusiasm for and the growth of running as a sort of glamorous and acceptable activity for American athletes. I mean, when Frank was training in New Mexico as a collegian, there was a certain point where his father had to drive behind him in a pickup truck with a shotgun because Frank was being threatened by people. I mean, I remember his father at one point said they should charge some of these folks that open their car doors at him and everything with attempted vehicular homicide. I mean, it was not easy to be a distance runner in those days. It was far easier in New England, where it had always been part of the landscape. But Shorter and Rogers and Burfoot and Galloway and, I mean, all the great runners that we had that really, had as their collegiate base of operations in New England. This was really, this is to marathoning maybe what the playgrounds of New York are to basketball. This was the place to be. But at the time that they were doing it, there was not a pot of gold waiting for them. I mean, there might be a gold medal, but there certainly was not any professional prospects of doing anything. So these athletes not only succeeded competitively, they helped create the industry of running. They sort of helped create the template for runners getting shoe contracts and belonging to sponsored track teams. And Frank's great friend Steve Prefontaine was one of the chief advocates of reforming the AAU rules to allow runners to have a stipend for just literally being able to pay the rent and being able to buy food. I mean, when Steve Prefontaine was on the front page of, every paper in the country prior to the 72 Olympics, he was living in a trailer. I mean, and he made money tending bar. So, this was a world-class athlete. So these athletes, not only did they succeed, and use Boston as a platform, but they, again, created the world that we live in now, where a runner actually can make a living doing that.
Yeah. And you spoke of Bill Rogers, my favorite of all time. I won a bet with friends. We're watching in Wellesley. Who wants to bet that Rogers is first? All my friends bet against me. I won a 6-pack that day. But I just remember vividly him running by me in that span where he won 3 consecutive 4 overall Boston marathons. He won 4 New York marathons during the same period. Just spectacular runner.
Spectacular runner. And he's an even better person. Bill is one of the most sort of gentle, soft-spoken people I've ever met in sports or not. And I remember when he and his brother Charlie owned the running store down at Quincy Market, you occasionally would see Bill training in Boston, just going out on a run. And I told them this a few times. I'd be in my car driving someplace, and I would immediately know when I would see him running by, because he floated over the ground. I mean, you couldn't teach a runner to run the way he did. You either had it or you didn't. I mean, the thing I'd compare it to is watching those slow motion films of Bobby Jones hitting a golf ball, where someone was smart enough to think we're going to capture him on film because it's just such a beautiful thing. And Bill is, he basically is has that same Bobby Jones-like quality, or Ted Williams, in slow-mo hitting a baseball. Again, he for so many years, it was great, because if you were down near Quincy Market on almost every day of the week, depending on what his schedule was, you go in and buy a pair of shoes. You're buying a pair of shoes from the greatest marathoner of his generation. I mean, certainly he and Frank, I think, would share the distinction, because Frank should finally be given credit for having won the 76 marathon in Montreal, because the runner that he competed against, Valdemar Czerpinski, was a doper, and that was proven by the files from the East German and Stasi that have it chapter and verse. I once asked him to sign an autograph on a poster that I had in my room of him in high school, and I said, "Would you sign it, two-time gold medal winner?" And he said, "No," he said, "but let me sign it for you." So he handed it back to me, and he had written, "Frank Shorter, 1972 gold, 1976 silver," in parentheses. That was great.
Wow.
Two of my heroes. But Bill, again, he's been described as the Peter Pan of running, because he's sort of ageless. I mean, Bill's what now, like 75 years old? You wouldn't know it, and he still runs as beautifully as ever, just a little slower. But he, to me, is one of the great heroes of the sport, because he was at the vanguard of professionalizing running in a way that was acceptable to the powers that be. I mean, it was a very difficult feat for them to accomplish, not meaning to have a pun there, but to get that done in an era where you couldn't accept anything. I mean, I think it was simply travel expenses, and that was it. I don't think travel expenses included hotel. So it was a completely different world, and but it certainly has opened the sport up. I mean, so it's a good thing.
And he was such a great runner. And then the women finally get their first Olympics, 1980, and Joni Benoit, 1979 course record, wins the gold at 80, and then 4 years later comes back, and I remember that race. She sets a world record.
Well, actually, I'm not meaning to be a point. It was 84, because in 80 we had boycotted the Olympics because of Russians. It probably could have been 80 and 84 too, but in 1984, Joni wins the Olympic trials 2 weeks after having arthroscopic surgery. I mean, talk about tough. And then she goes to Los Angeles, and talk about an athlete that, if you underestimated her, you basically were dead as a doornail. You would not underestimate her one bit. When she won that race in Los Angeles, I remember, they're watching on TV with the rest of us, and I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. Either she's the human version of Secretariat, or she made a wrong turn, or the rest of the field took a wrong turn. Something's going on here. I'm betting it's the Secretariat thing, and that's what it was. I mean, she destroyed that field. I mean, she didn't just win that race. She owned it. She owned the air rights over it. I mean, it was just so remarkable. And I'd known Joan from at the time I was at Bates College, and I ran against her brother Peter, who was a member of the Bowdoin cross country team, and she's one of our own. When she won Boston in 1979, she's wearing a Red Sox hat. I mean, how cool is that? And she's wearing her Bowdoin cross country jersey. I mean, and to this day, she remains sort of very much in the same class as Bill Rogers in terms of, you wouldn't meet a more gentle soul. I mean, but gentle soul, but Jekyll Hyde with her is, if you're competing, if you're in a race with her, she's a cannibal. I mean, she's going to eat you alive. And of course, I would love to talk to some of the runners who competed against her, because I'm sure they would share the same experiences. But the great thing is, Joan continues to run marathons to this day. And 2 years ago, was attempting to be the first runner over the age of 60 or the first female runner over the age of 60 to run a sub 3 hour marathon. Now, Joan, I believe, is now 63 or 4, and I bet she'll do it. I mean, she is one tough cookie, and she continues to love doing it too. So again, part of the New England tradition of the Boston Marathon, I think, this is very important to note too, is that any number of champions have continued to run throughout their lives. So Clarence DeMar was Johnny Kelly before Johnny Kelly. I mean, Clarence DeMar competed at Boston well into his later years, and he was only felled by cancer. I mean, DeMar sort of set the standard for endurance and for continuing to make Boston a staple. In fact, in the years before Johnny Kelly would be the one that you would have to see to have really watched Boston, you would have been judged not to have watched the Boston Marathon until you saw Clarence DeMar run by and you cheered him. So, a generation or a generation and a half before Johnny, you had to cheer for Clarence. And then came the inimitable Johnny Kelly, who, Runner's World named Runner of the Century in 2000. And I mean, he literally ran through the 20th century in 61 Boston marathons. Are you kidding? And it's interesting that the baton was handed to Johnny by Johnny, not literally but figuratively, to the Hoyts. And I think one of the great stories of Boston are Dick and Rick Hoyt, and we mourn the loss of Dick Hoyt this year. They symbolize what Boston has become, what the marathon has become: an inclusive event. Blind runners, disabled runners, wheelchair competitors, they basically, I mean, they almost combine like 3 of those 4 categories themselves just alone. I mean, and the fact is that it was a bond between father and son that became a bond and a symbol to the world at large for treating the disabled with respect, engaging them in competition, in events that fostered fellowship and international understanding. I honestly think that the Hoyts should have received the Nobel Peace Prize. Why do I say that? I say that because they traveled to over 80 countries, many of which were countries in which the disabled were warehoused, were put behind concrete walls in hospitals or care facilities where they never saw the light of day and were really taken to be forgotten. They kicked those doors down. They didn't just open those doors, they kicked them down. Not literally, but they did so with their example, with their spirit, with their soul and heart, with their competitive spirit, with, all that they brought to the table and to the starting line of any event they were involved with. And Dick became a public speaker of note. I mean, I forget whether I asked him how many speeches he'd given, but it was in the hundreds and in 80 countries. And the fact is that it was the result of his son having seen a notice for a road race and asked if they both could be in it. Can you imagine? And Dick wasn't a runner before that. He wasn't but his son wanted to do that. They could share this. Not only did they share it and, sort of overcome some of the hurdles with it, but they developed a competition share that they could use for the events they were in. They branched out into the triathloning. I mean, I'm not sure what else they could do. I mean, there probably wasn't a path up Mount Everest, but if there had been, I'm sure they'd have tried that as well. But they knocked down walls, they burst through doors, and every time they would do it, Rick would say, "I beat my dad every time."
Well, I'll tell you, Richard, that actually strikes a chord with me. I am the son of a polio victim, excuse me, and I've never met a tougher person. And I'll tell you what, I don't know if you guys had seen it, but recently Rick did an interview with WBZ, where he's talking about the passing of his dad.
Yeah.
Really, really great story, something that always grabs me and makes me grab a box of tissues at times. But let me get back to the decade plus starting in the 70s, where it was still pretty much an amateur's race.
Yeah.
And you had, like you said, the working class that would show up, but it was also becoming an international event.
Yeah.
And I think it was either 1985 or 1986 when prize money was first introduced. What do you think about that and how it changed the marathon?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 86. Well, it was a move that had to be made. And my old friend Will Cloney tried to do it at first, and it was a shame because, he got involved with a gentleman that was rather unscrupulous about things, and it just did not meet the standard for what should have happened. You're trying to do the right thing. I mean, and he never made a dime off of any of this himself. So I want to make sure that Will Cloney is remembered as a hero, capital H, of the marathon and the BAA for all that he did. But once the sponsorship of John Hancock came in, and as importantly, the stewardship of Guy Morse as executive director of the marathon and of the BAA, did a remarkable job in the transition to the professional era, and then also the expansion of the race as a public entity. So as an event that embraced the disabled, the wheelchair community, that really started the tradition of the bibs being available for worthy charities. So Guy Morse, in my book, is the great unsung hero of the BAA and the Boston Marathon for all that he's done. So I want to make sure that I got that in. And then when John Hancock comes in, that really establishes a sponsorship threshold, which has just been remarkable. I mean, they've really sort of turned the marathon into Boston's other big league team. I mean, it has that much of a profile in both the local sports landscape as well as the national and international landscape. So, and all of that, again, was under the stewardship of Guy Morse, who was a very worthy successor to Will Cloney. And so, in fact, I think he would be a great guest for you to have on sometime to talk about that. Gosh, I think he was executive director for 20 or 25 years, but it was a period of growth. I mean, what would it be like? It would be like having been a person that was, coming up with the idea of being able to shop at something called Amazon, and then what it had become. I mean, Guy was very adept politically and from a business standpoint and a human relation standpoint to negotiate all of the impediments and clear the hurdles that existed with trying to put this all together. And certainly the BAA board deserves a lot of credit too, but Guy was the day-to-day guy. Guy was the guy. So I want to underscore that. But, it was a period in which there had to be an acceptance of runners as professional athletes. The same thing happened in tennis. I mean, in tennis, you had a tour that included Jack Kramer back in the 50s that was professional, but once these guys had competed as amateurs and had won events like the U.S. Open, they weren't allowed to compete in those events anymore. It was only until years later that professionals in tennis became the norm. It was, that was everyone was a professional competing at an elite level. And certainly this is, this is true in the history of really each sport. You have to go back pretty far. So in 1869, when the Cincinnati Red Stockings were the first professional team, and the citizens of Cincinnati, or at least the power structure there, wasn't real happy with that, and most of those players moved to Boston and helped start a league that survived and then eventually became the National League, and the rest is history. That team is still playing. It's known as the Atlanta Braves. But there's a struggle and a transition period for almost every sport in terms of players going from either being impoverished semi-pros to established professionals to superstars, and that's occurred in marathoning as well. It's not as prominent. I mean, we don't know how much. You'd have to be a real track person to know how much money an athlete made per year, and they don't have a list like the PGA, the golfers or anything. But the fact is it went from nothing to something pretty substantial fairly quickly, and Boston was a latecomer to that, but is now, prominent. I mean, basically, part of the appeal of coming to Boston is not only being part of a tradition and adding your name to the list of the greats, but they offer a very competitive salary package. But it's based on performance, so it's not like paying a 220 hitter $8 million a year and having to eat the contract. No. If you get the money, you have to have the accomplishment first, and then you get the money. So, that makes it a little bit different than other professional sports.
Sure. So bear with me on this, guys, in this lead. In 1904 in the Olympics, Fred Lors ran 9 miles, cramped up, hitched a ride, rode for 11 miles, got off, ran the final 5, and Teddy Roosevelt's daughter put the wreath around him until somebody yelled out imposter. There are things called course cutting and bib muling, where somebody will run for somebody else. Yep. And there's also been recently the retro bandit. They caught this guy. He was wearing a 1996 vintage bib, and they finally caught him, I think, a couple of years ago. He takes selfies, he take the medal. But this woman in October of 1979 qualified for the Boston Marathon by riding the New York subway. Please talk about Rosie Ruiz.
Oh, God, Rosie Ruiz. Well, she has sort of a tragic life. She died recently, and I mean, it was not a happy story. I mean, she jumps in the race. I'm not sure exactly where. I don't know whether they've ever identified the point. I think it might have even been Kenmore Square, which is ridiculous. I mean, that's come on. And when she crossed the finish line, Bill Rogers, who had won that year too, he was already on the victory stand with the mayor and the governor, and he's looking at this runner being led up by police to the victory stand to pose with him. And I think the term he used was, she was cellulite city. I mean, she was not a runner. She wasn't a fit runner. I mean, she didn't even look like someone who'd run in the park on, Sunday. But he had to smile. I mean, he's a complete gentleman, of course. So he grinned and, oh, hello, hi. And it was, Jacqueline Gouraud from Quebec, who won, was denied the opportunity on the day of her victory to enjoy all of the, credit and cheers and attention that she, now to complete credit to the BAA afterwards, once they determined that Ruiz was not the champion, they made sure that Jackie Gouraud came back to Boston and was given, all of the credit that she deserved. And of course, the running community embraced her tremendously. I mean, I'm sure at a certain point she got sick of people coming up to her and saying, "We're so sorry about what happened." Well, but she is truly beloved, and of course there's a great tradition of runners from Quebec winning Boston too, and she's part of that. But the Ruiz thing, it pointed out, I don't know, structural flaws. I don't know whether I'd call them flaws, but it's just that events with that much class and tradition are often vulnerable to, I mean, even the Olympics have been vulnerable. Think of the crazy defrocked priest in Athens who, stormed, this was in 2004, I think, storms out of the crowd in Athens and pushes the runner from Brazil who was going to win the Olympic marathon. He ended up winning a bronze, but he basically pushed him off course and upset his pace and everything to such a degree that it cost him this cost them the championship. I mean, so a marathon, and of course the bombing is another example of how that's a vulnerable event, that any nut on the course could do something terrible to disrupt things. I mean, the only sort of humorous story of that kind that I can point out was in 1907. Tom Longboat, who was the champion that year, a great runner from Canada, Tom Longboat and the other 14 top runners in the race that year had just crossed the train track in Framingham ahead of a freight train that delayed the other 114 runners behind them. So I think it's pretty safe to say it didn't affect the outcome of the race, because certainly the top 14 are probably going to stay in some degree of 1 to 14. Maybe one of the runners that was cut off had a chance to, compete for a top 3 position. But, can you imagine standing there and this freight train's going by endlessly while the runners you're competing against have gotten sort of a handicap, not a head start, but they've been given a tremendous advantage. Well, it's part of the fabric of Boston. It's one of those crazy stories. Of course, it would never happen now, but the Ruiz thing pointed out that they needed to, at some point, develop the computer chips that they put on the shoes that they've used. It's resulted in certainly the cost of the entry fee going up, because every time a new challenge is presented, it requires more security, more technology, a greater degree of staffing. So the race, has gone from the Stone Age to the Space Age in, the 124 years it's been held. But, the fact is that we pray each year that nothing like that happens. I mean, certainly the Ruiz thing is a mild form of it. The bombing is, the thing I compare the bombing to, it's like when you're standing waiting for the subway at an indoor, at an underground station. I mean, I'm always afraid. Maybe this is just a crazy thing, but I always stand back. I'm always afraid someone's going to get pushed in front of a train by some crazy person. I mean, that's another vulnerable place where, it's open to the public. Anyone can do anything like that. You pray they don't. But so the marathon course, but you can't, you certainly couldn't hold the marathon with restrictions for 26 miles, have it being competed in a tunnel of steel gates or something. I mean, that's not right. Part of the charm of Boston is that it is, it's just certain parts of the course are sort of like a keg party with a race going through it. I mean, on days where the weather's warm enough for the kids at the various colleges to be hanging out on the fire escapes of their apartments with a cooler of beer and a grill, cooking hot dogs and cheering. Well, they're spectating. They're watching you run. They're cheering you on. I mean, it's really cool. I mean, you could often tell where you'd be on the course just by what it smelled like. And I mean, as you got close to Kenmore Square in the ballpark, I mean, I only ran it that 1 year, but I distinctly remember smelling the hot dogs and the Italian sausages that the vendors were selling that day, because they weren't just selling it to the ballpark crowd that day. They're selling it to the folks going to the marathon to watch their friends and family compete. So, this is an event that you experience with your feet, your heart, your lungs, your eyes, your ears, and your nose. You're getting it all that day, and it's really, there's something quite charming about it. I skipped the beef stew afterwards, though, I must say. I was so sore. I was so sore afterwards. My parents were there. My parents and my sister were there. We went back to her apartment in Cambridge. I took a long bath, and then we went to Legal Seafoods. You can't get more Boston than that.
That's awesome.
And Dick, I think if we could just circle back,
Sure.
I lived an eighth of a mile in Watertown, an eighth of a mile where terrorist number 1, number 2 were confronted, And I remember seeing a plane go by. It was my first drone I'd ever seen. I said, "Who's flying a radio-controlled plane at this hour?" And I remember listening to it on the radio. NPR was giving you the second-by-second description of the confrontation. I still get chill bumps. But if you could talk about, and without mentioning names, I know that there were 3 victims and arguably 4 or 5 victims, but what a disgrace. It was an attack on the city. It was an attack on the United States. It was an attack on sports.
Well, I remember that day distinctly because we had taken our daughter down to a college visit at Connecticut College, and we were driving back, and gosh, it was probably around Providence where, trying to think now. Oh yeah, no, I had called my son on his cell phone because I knew he was going to the ball game and was going to watch the marathon that day because at least 1 or 2 friends of his were in the race that day. And we kept calling him, and we weren't connecting at all. We weren't even getting the voicemail or anything. So it's like, what's going on? And then I turned the radio on just to listen to, the coverage of the marathon. And I mentioned the bombing as it was happening, or just after it had happened. So we had tried calling him about 10 minutes earlier, and I thought it's strange there wasn't any. And then we hear about this bombing, and I'm thinking, well, I know he had gone there to watch the race, and then once we finally got a hold of him, after we got home, in fact, it was probably a good 2 or 3 hours afterwards, so we were really worried. He said, no, he said he and his friends were like a block away. And when those bombs went off, they felt them. They were really scared. And he was really spooked by it for months and months afterwards. In fact, he really doesn't like to talk about it now. Well, that, but the other story attached to that event, and it is remarkable. I mean, I know they've made movies about it now, they've written any number of books about it, but it's still just absolutely amazes me the speed with which the authorities apprehended them. One, of course, they apprehended as a corpse because his brother had run him over. I mean, well, that's the one good thing he did. He did accomplish one good, one good deed. That's about it, though. And then the manhunt, where they find this guy hidden in a boat, dry docked in the backyard of a house in Watertown, and they use heat surveillance, so they know he's in there. And I mean, how do you do that? I mean, I know it's been analyzed, and I know that that there are books about this and stuff, but I still can't get over my wonderment at how that all came together. That we have surveillance cameras on and everything, but you know what? We would have never found this guy if there hadn't been. And so the forensic work that was done on this, just the legwork that was done, I mean, it is just absolutely one of the great law enforcement stories of all time. So, and then what's occurred since then with the BAA, we all knew that the BAA and the race would bounce back. Dave McGilvery, who I've known for 48 years, is the perfect one to manage the operations of the race. There's no better person in the world doing that. He's another person who would be an absolutely perfect interview topic, because he could talk about that role that he's played for years, as well as the fact that he's done things like run across the country twice, and once ran from spring training in Florida to Fenway Park to raise money for the Jimmy Fund. So, I mean, he's another world-class figure that's part of the cast of the BAA marathon. I mean,
yeah, he's an American Terry Fox, is what he is.
Yeah, he's an American Terry Fox, and he very much is a person who, from a business standpoint, I mean, he basically helped to create the industry too, because his company, BMSE Sports, created a local series of triathlons that were co-sponsored with the Sports Museum and Toyota back in the 1980s. He is a consultant to every significant race or event on the planet. If you haven't talked to Dave McGilvery, you haven't gone to the source. It's a little bit like, having gone to Robert Trent Jones if you were designing a golf course. He's the guy.
Right. And I guess, Kevin, your comments and what are your recollections of that day in April 2013?
All I can remember is I was on a treadmill at the gym, and it seemed to be so insignificant when I saw it. Now, I wasn't listening. I was just watching on a TV. And then to see what happened, transpired after that was just unbelievable. The graphic pictures that came out, it made you sick to your stomach. But one of the things, you guys harken back to the Watertown police and the way that they converged on these suspects, and they, everybody was shut down, but they were happy to be shut down.
Yeah.
And when the young one was taken from the boat, and just the reaction from the neighborhood, just saluting those people that had gone forward when we had just seen such the worst of things going on. To me, that's what I remember most. And of course, being a sports fan, I loved it when Big Papi spoke when he came back. That was great.
It was great. And then the national anthem at the Bruins game was where Rene Rancourt knew enough to just let the crowd do it. And it's like, I'm getting goosebumps right now thinking about it. I mean,
can I tell you a story about that, Dick? We did a Bruins alumni game. Some of the first responders from ATF played in it. And at that time, I had CDs. I'd play the national anthem. I was so far behind. Yeah. And I played the CD. Everybody rise. I do all the intros. Everybody please rise. In a moment of silence for the victims of the marathon bombing. As we play the national anthem, I play it. It's not going. Swoop. Bob Sweeney looks up at me like, you got to be kidding me. And say can. The whole crowd started singing with me and bailed me out of key. And I'll never forget that for the rest of my life. And Bob Sweeney led everybody singing and bailed me out. So way to go, Swoop. Yeah, I want to close this with it's a very special day in Boston, Patriots Day. 3 enactment at Lexington Concord. I remember falling face first on Old North Bridge. I was in the vanguard when your musket misfires. I was part of the Lincoln Minutemen, and I couldn't load a musket. I lying in the drizzle for 40 minutes, and then you go and you take in a Sox game at 11 a.m. and you catch the finish of the marathon. That's a full day. And in the weather, if you could just talk about that, and then the weather, Dick, you made a great comment about today as we record this, the snow that we've had. So it's just a very special day in New England. If we could wrap with that,
it's some days it's the longest day, but it's also oftentimes the best day, because it'll be a day when someone's maybe run their first and only Boston, and it's the day that they'll never forget. It's a day where there's maybe a kid going to his first ball game and seeing the marathon, because the two are just inextricably combined. And it's also a day where, depending on, the schedules of the winter pro teams, that either can be a late season or regular season game at the Garden that night, or a playoff game. So you have everything but the Patriots doing a drill on Boston Common. I mean, the ones who play football, not the ones with the muskets. But the fact is that it's a day that can only exist in Boston. It can't be duplicated elsewhere. We have it. It's our property, and it's our pride and joy.
Gentlemen, I'll tell you, that was a lot of fun. It's one of the things that makes this city so unique, so diverse when it comes to sports. And there's a clamoring to look back at those who have come before us, not only historically, but sports-wise. It just kind of brings you back to home, makes you think of a happier day. I know we ended on the marathon bombings, but that will always go down as a very special day in the history of Boston.
Yes.
And I just want to thank you both for your insight. That was remarkable. I feel smarter just by standing by.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you, Dick. Great show. Hey everyone, it's me, John. Hello. I'm at the fire station here in Newton, and we're beginning the climb of the 4 hills of Newton in the Boston Marathon, which will culminate in climbing Heartbreak Hill. Now, I'm not a runner, I'm a walker, but just coming in here and driving it, there's quite an incline. And it's always been the make or break place for runners here in the marathon because their glycogen levels, their muscular glycogen levels are depleted at this point, and they have to find something extra and dig down. So I wanted to walk here and then show you a couple of statues that you've seen the images previously during the discussion of the Boston Marathon with myself, Kevin, and Dick. So in this walk on Heartbreak Hill, I wanted to tell you about the 4 hills of Newton and also salute some of the contemporary champions of the Boston Marathon, which has been dominated by runners from Ethiopia and Kenya. And they've won it multiple times, set course records. But I also want to talk about the women, the stars of today that are running the Boston Marathon. The first man to win the first wheelchair division race for the Boston Marathon was Robert Hall. He won it in 1975, and he would come back and win it again in 1977. Canadian Andre Vigé would win it 3 times. And then it was Jim Nobb's turn. He won it twice in the early 80s. 10 years later, in the early 90s, he would rattle off 3 in a row. Jim Nobb would win 5 Boston Marathon men's wheelchair divisions. Franz Nietlisbach from Switzerland would win 5 Boston Marathon men's wheelchair divisions, including 4 in a row. I'm now moving off the first hill of the 4 in Newton, on my way to Heartbreak Hill. So then came Ernst van Dijk of South Africa. He would win 9 out of 10 Boston Marathon men's wheelchair divisions, including 6 in a row. And finally, as we get closer to this era, from 2015 through 2018, Marcel Hug from Switzerland won it 4 times in a row, including a course record of 1:13:05. Sharon Rahn of the United States won the inaugural women's wheelchair division race in 1977. Candace Cable Brooks of the United States won an unprecedented 6 times in the 1980s. Jean Driscoll of the United States won 7 consecutive women's division victories in the Boston Marathon from 1990 through 1996. And then she came back and won an incredible 8th time in the year 2000. Japan's Wakako Tushida won it 5 consecutive times from 2007 through 2011. American Tatiana McFadden won it 5 times between 2013 and 2018. The current course record is held by Swiss rider Manuela Schar from Switzerland, a time of 1 hour, 28 minutes, and 17 seconds. In 2017, the hand cycle division was introduced, and Tom Davis has won all 3 races from the United States. Also in 2017, Michelle Love from the United States was the only female participant in the hand cycle division for women. If you look at the cumulative victories across all divisions, the United States is in first, followed by Kenya second, Canada third, Japan, and Switzerland. As the 1980s rolled around, the Bill Rogers era was over. Toshihiko Seiko of Japan won it in 1981. He would also win it in 87. In 82, Alberto Salazar from the United States. And Greg Meyer from 1983. In 84 and 85, it was Jeff Smith from Great Britain. The first African to win the Boston Marathon was in 1988 from Kenya, Ibrahim Hussein. He would go on to win it 2 more times. In 1989, Abibi Mekinen was the first Ethiopian to win the Boston Marathon. From 1993 through 1995, Cosmas Ndeti of Kenya won 3 consecutive Boston Marathons, including a course record in '94. In the earlier part of this century, in 2003, 06, 07, and 08, Robert Kipchoge Cheruiyot won it 4 times, including a course record in '06. Lalisa Desisa, also from Kenya, won it twice in 2013 and 2015. But it was Geoffrey Mutai from Kenya who not only set the course record at 2 hours, 3 minutes, and 2 seconds, but it was also a world record for marathons, and he did that in 2011. For the women, of course, Bobby Gibb is credited with winning the first 3 unofficial Boston Marathons, and then Sarah Mae Berman from the United States won 3 herself. Fatuma Roba from Ethiopia won 3 consecutive women's divisions from 1997 through 1999, including a course record. And then there was the immortal Catherine Ndariba from Kenya. She won it 4 times. In fact, she set a world record for women in marathons in Chicago when she ran an astounding 2 hours, 18 minutes, and 47 seconds. In 2014, Buzanesh Diba of Ethiopia set the Boston Marathon record for women with a time of 2 hours, 19 minutes, and 59 seconds. So Johnny Kelly actually ran 61 Boston Marathons and only finished 58 times. But he represented the United States in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin and also in 1948. In 1992, Johnny Kelly ran his final race at the age of 84, and in 1995, he was named the Grand Marshal. But perhaps the most famous Boston Marathon that Johnny Kelly is known for is a marathon that he didn't win. He almost did, though. What Johnny Kelly is most known for is the 1939 Boston Marathon. That's where he closed a half-mile deficit behind Ellison Tarzan Brown from Rhode Island, a Native American from the Narragansett tribe. He would be the second Native American to win the Boston Marathon after Tom Longboat did it in 1907. So as it says in the 4 Hills of Newton, this is where they test the runners. Johnny Kelly trailed Ellison Tarzan Brown. Now Brown had won the Boston Marathon before in 1936. In fact, he was a colorful character and people looked forward to seeing him run by. In 1935, with 5 miles to go, he took off his sneakers and threw them into the crowd. In 1937, on a hot day, realizing that he couldn't win the race, he decided to take a swim in Lake Cochituate. And finally, in 1939, he was out on a blistering pace. He would set a course record at 2 hours and 28 minutes. And a half mile behind him as they entered the Hills of Newton was Johnny Kelly, his rival. Kelly somehow closed the gap. And as he reached Ellison Tarzan Brown at the crest of the final hill here in Newton, he tapped him on the shoulder. That startled Brown, and he darted, as Dick said, like a rabbit, and would go on to win the Boston Marathon. Later, Jerry Nason, a Boston sports writer, would say that badly beaten Johnny Kelly, but his great heart is not broken. Nason would go on to name this final hill between miles 20 and 21 as Heartbreak Hill. And it would become iconic in the lexicon of Boston Marathon. To his dying day in 2004, Johnny Kelly was remorseful about tapping Tarzan Brown on the shoulder. Now, Tarzan Brown lived a really tragic life. He was killed when he was hit by a car crossing the street outside of a Westerly bar in Rhode Island. But he's known for this particular race because this is why we call these hills, the Hills of Newton, the final one that I'm about to ascend, Heartbreak Hill. And of course, the road across the street from the monument is called Ellison Road in honor of Ellison Tarzan Brown. So even though the term Heartbreak Hill is credited to writer Jerry Nason of the Boston Globe, there was an actual reference to these sets of hills in Newton in 1907 in the Boston Globe where they called them the Heartbreaking Hills of Newton. I'm at the corner of Grant and Commonwealth. This is where Mark Proctor and Charlotte McKee for years had this maple tree that was dying. So last year, 2020, they decided to make something good out of it. And they commissioned sculptor Ken Packey to carve a runner. And you can see the broken heart underneath his right leg. This marks the summit of the 4th and final hill in Newton known as Heartbreak Hill at 20.4 miles. So just walking up these 4 sloping hills of Newton, I can understand the grade and the incline of these hills. And how it could devastate a runner, as they have already run 17 miles in the Boston Marathon. It keeps going up, 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 then it gives you downhill, then up, up, up again. It isn't the greatest elevation or the greatest hill in any American marathon. That's probably Chicago. Heartbreak Hill is really only an elevation of anywhere between 88 or 91 feet, depending upon who you reference. So that does it for this segment on Heartbreak Hill and some of the marathon victors of the 21st century. For Kevin Flanagan and Dick Johnson, I'm John Horrigan for Then It Was a Game. Thanks so much for joining us.